In the year 1539, when the world still held vast oceans of mystery and the edges of maps bore the ominous warning, "Here be monsters," a Swedish ecclesiastic named Olaus Magnus completed what would become one of the most extraordinary documents of maritime knowledge ever compiled. The Carta Marina, his great map of the Nordic seas, presented not merely geographical features, but a comprehensive catalog of the creatures that dwelt beneath the waves. Creatures so fantastical that modern eyes might dismiss them as medieval fancy, yet so meticulously documented that they demand serious consideration as testimony from an age when the boundary between natural philosophy and wonder was far more porous than today. Olaus Magnus, Archbishop of Uppsala in exile, had spent decades collecting account from sailors, fishermen, merchants, and fellow clergy who had witnessed the impossible made manifest in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. His work emerged during a period of unprecedented maritime exploration, when European vessels were pushing into previously unknown waters and returning with tales that challenged every assumption about the natural world. The Reformation had driven Magnus from his native Sweden, but his displacement only intensified his scholarly mission to preserve and document the knowledge of the Nordic peoples before it was lost to political upheaval and religious transformation. The methodology of Magnus was remarkably systematic for his era. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied heavily on classical sources and biblical interpretation, Magnus insisted on gathering first-hand testimony from those who had actually encountered these marine phenomena. He established a network of correspondence throughout the Baltic Sea region, from Bergen to Riga, from Stockholm to Copenhagen, each charged with collecting detailed accounts of unusual marine encounters. His approach was empirical in a way that would not be fully appreciated until the scientific revolution of the following century. The creatures described in Magnus' accounts fell into several distinct categories, each presenting unique characteristics that suggested different species or perhaps different developmental stages of the same organisms. The great sea serpents, which formed the most numerous category in his collection, were described with remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources. These beings, according to the testimonies Magnus gathered, could reach lengths of 200 feet or more, with bodies as thick as wine barrels and heads that rose above the water like ships' masts. Their movement through the water was said to create distinctive patterns, not the smooth glide of a fish, but a series of undulating coils that broke the surface in regular intervals, creating what mariners called the serpent's chain. Captain Hendrik Johansen of the merchant vessel Margarita provided one of the most detailed accounts in Magnus' collection. In the summer of 1534, while navigating the waters between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, Johansen's crew encountered what they initially mistook for a series of floating logs. The objects appeared to be drifting with the current, dark and motionless, arranged in a peculiar pattern that suggested some kind of debris from shipwreck. As the Margarita approached to investigate, the logs suddenly animated, revealing themselves to be segments of an enormous serpentine creature that had been resting at the surface. Johansen's account, preserved in Magnus' meticulous Latin, described a head that emerged from the water with the deliberate majesty of a rising cathedral spire. The creature's eyes, each as large as a ship's wheel, possessed an intelligence that the captain found deeply unsettling. The beast made no aggressive moves toward the vessel, but its very presence seemed to alter the nature of the sea itself. The water around the creature took on an unusual clarity, as if purified by some unknown property of the beast's skin. Fish of various species gathered near the serpent in great numbers, swimming in organized schools that seemed to respond to subtle movements of the creature's massive body. The encounter lasted nearly 3 hours, during which time Johansen and his crew observed the serpent feeding. The creature's method of hunting was unlike anything in their experience. Rather than pursuing individual fish, the serpent positioned itself vertically in the water, with only its head visible above the surface. It then began to emit a low, resonant sound that seemed to travel through both air and water. This call had a profound effect on the surrounding marine life, drawing creatures from considerable distances to swim directly toward the serpent's open mouth. The process appeared almost hypnotic, as if the sound possessed some power to override the natural survival instincts of the smaller fish. Magnus' documentation of this feeding behavior aligned with numerous other accounts he had collected, suggesting that these great serpents possessed abilities that transcended conventional understanding of marine predation. The sound they produced was described consistently across multiple testimonies as having an almost musical quality, though one that induced a strange melancholy in human listeners. Several accounts mention that crew members exposed to these calls for extended periods experienced vivid dreams for weeks afterward, dreams filled with images of underwater cities and vast libraries carved into the seafloor. The sirens documented by Magnus presented an even more complex mystery. Unlike the classical sirens of Mediterranean mythology, the Nordic variety appeared to possess a physical reality that was both more concrete and more disturbing than their ancient counterparts. These beings were consistently described as having partially human appearance, but with anatomical modifications that clearly adapted them to aquatic life. Their lower bodies resembled those of seals or dolphins, but their torsos maintained human characteristics, including what appeared to be functional respiratory systems capable of operating both above and below water. Brother Antonius of the monastery at Vadstena provided Magnus with one of the most detailed accounts of siren interaction. In 1536, while traveling by boat to deliver manuscripts to the monastery at Naantali, Brother Antonius and his companions encountered a group of 7 sirens near the island of Åland. The creatures approached the boat without apparent fear, swimming alongside the vessel for several miles. Their behavior suggested not malevolent intent, but rather an intense curiosity about the human occupants. The sirens communicated among themselves using a complex system of musical phrases that seemed to convey specific meanings. Brother Antonius, who possessed considerable musical training, attempted to transcribe their songs using conventional notation, though he noted that the sounds included frequencies and intervals that challenged the capabilities of human vocal cords. The sirens appeared to recognize his efforts at documentation, and one of the creatures began to modify its song, apparently attempting to accommodate the limitations of human hearing. The most remarkable aspect of Brother Antonius's encounter was the sirens' apparent familiarity with human language. While they could not reproduce human speech with complete accuracy, they demonstrated clear understanding of Latin, Swedish, and what appeared to be several other European languages. When Brother Antonius spoke to them in Latin, one of the sirens responded with a series of sounds that, while not precisely matching Latin phonetics, clearly attempted to mirror the rhythm and intonation of his words. The creature seemed particularly interested in religious terminology, repeating words like sanctus and benedictus with obvious fascination. The siren's interest in religious language troubled Brother Antonius considerably. According to his account, preserved in Magnus' careful hand, the creatures appeared to possess some understanding of Christian concepts, but interpreted them through a framework that was fundamentally alien to human theology. When a monk attempted to explain the concept of salvation, the sirens responded with songs that seemed to describe a different kind of spiritual reality altogether, one in which souls traveled not upward toward heaven, but downward into the deepest parts of the ocean, where they joined vast communities of consciousness that existed in states of being that had no equivalent in terrestrial experience. Magnus recognized that these accounts challenged conventional understanding not only of marine biology, but of theology itself. If these creatures possessed souls, as their apparent spiritual awareness suggested, what were the implications for Christian doctrine? The archbishop found himself in the position of documenting phenomena that his own religious training had not prepared him to interpret. His solution was to present the evidence without forcing it into predetermined theological categories, allowing future scholars to grapple with the implications. The Leviathans described in Magnus' collection represented perhaps the most awe-inspiring category of marine life documented in his work. These were creatures of such immense size and power that they seemed to exist at the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. Unlike the serpents, which appear to be highly active predators, or the sirens, which demonstrated complex social behaviors, the Leviathans were portrayed as ancient beings whose very existence altered the fundamental nature of their marine environment. Captain Eric Nordahl of the whaling vessel Heimdall encountered what was almost certainly a Leviathan during the harsh winter of 1537. Nordahl's ship had been tracking a pod of whales through the waters northwest of the Lofoten Islands when his crew observed what they initially interpreted as an island that had somehow appeared overnight in a region they had navigated many times before. The island possessed several unusual characteristics that gradually aroused suspicion among the experienced mariners. Most notably, it seemed to generate its own weather, with clouds forming directly above it despite clear skies in all other directions. As the Heimdall approached this mysterious landmass, Nordahl began to notice that what he had taken for rocky outcroppings along its shore displayed a peculiar regularity of pattern that suggested organic rather than geological origin. The surface of the island appeared to be covered with what looked like massive scales, each one larger than the ship's main sail. More disturbing still was the gradual realization that the island was breathing. The movement was almost imperceptible at first, gentle rising and falling that could have been mistaken for the normal action of tides against the shoreline. But as Nordahl's crew watched in growing amazement and terror, the rhythm became unmistakable. The entire island was slowly inhaling and exhaling, and with each breath, currents in the surrounding water shifted in patterns that defied all normal oceanographic principles. Schools of fish moved in vast spirals around the creature, their behavior suggesting they were responding to forces that the human observers could not perceive. Nordahl ordered his crew to maintain a respectful distance while he attempted to estimate the size of the creature. Using the mountains of his homeland as reference points, he calculated that the Leviathan was at least 10 miles in length, with a width of perhaps 3 miles. The creature's breathing cycle operated on a timescale that seemed almost geological, each inhalation lasting approximately 20 minutes, followed by a similar period of exhalation. During the exhaling phase, the water around the creature became significantly warmer, and the crew of the Heimdall observed that ice formations in the area melted rapidly, only to reform during the subsequent inhalation cycle. The most extraordinary aspect of the encounter occurred when Nordahl decided to test the creature's awareness by firing one of the ship's cannons into the air. The sound of the gunpowder explosion seemed insignificant against the immensity of the Leviathan, but the response was immediate and unmistakable. The creature's breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more rapid. The water around the island began to glow with a soft phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the creature's respiration. Most remarkably, the Leviathan began to emit sounds, not the sharp calls of the serpents or the musical phrases of the sirens, but deep, resonant tones that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of the ocean floor. These sounds had a profound effect on Nordahl's crew. Several men reported that the tones seemed to bypass their ears entirely, resonating instead within their bones and organs. The ship's compass began to spin wildly, and all metallic objects aboard the vessel vibrated in harmony with the creature's vocalizations. The experience lasted for nearly 6 hours, during which time the crew found themselves unable to navigate away from the Leviathan's vicinity, as if the creature's presence had altered the fundamental properties of space and time in the surrounding waters. When the encounter finally ended, it was not because Nordahl's crew managed to escape, but because the Leviathan itself chose to depart. The creature's submersion was a process that took the better part of a day to complete. As it sank beneath the waves, vast whirlpools formed around its body, creating temporary canyons in the ocean that revealed glimpses of the sea floor thousands of feet below. The water displaced by the creature's descent created waves that reached the shores of Norway 3 days later, causing flooding in coastal communities that had no understanding of the distant cause of their misfortune. Magnus recognized that accounts like Nordahl's challenged not only scientific understanding, but the very framework of human perception. How could creatures of such magnitude exist without being commonly known? What did their presence imply about the true nature of the oceans that covered most of the Earth's surface? The Archbishop's training in theology provided him with conceptual tools for grappling with mysteries that transcended human understanding. But even his faith was tested by the implications of the evidence he was collecting. The pattern that emerged from Magnus' comprehensive documentation suggested that these creatures were not random anomalies, but components of a complex ecosystem that operated according to principles that human science had not yet discovered. The serpents, sirens, and Leviathans appeared to interact with each other in ways that indicated sophisticated communication networks spanning vast distances. Multiple accounts described serpents gathering in large numbers during the breeding seasons of whales, as if the two species were connected by some form of symbiotic relationship. The sirens, meanwhile, seemed to serve as intermediaries between the human world and the deeper mysteries of the ocean. Their apparent linguistic abilities and their interest in human religious concepts suggested that they might possess knowledge that could bridge the gap between terrestrial and aquatic consciousness. Several accounts in Magnus' collection described sirens appearing in the aftermath of sea serpent sightings, as if they were investigators seeking to understand the impact of these encounters on human witnesses. The Leviathans represented something even more profound, creatures so ancient and powerful that they seem to exist outside normal temporal frameworks. The consistency of accounts describing their ability to alter local weather patterns and oceanographic conditions suggested that these beings wielded forces that human science could not yet comprehend. Their rare appearances seemed to coincide with significant historical events, leading Magnus to wonder whether these creatures possessed some form of prophetic awareness or whether their emergence from the depths was itself a cause of historical transformation. Magnus' documentation methods included not only written testimonies, but also artistic representations based on eyewitness descriptions. Working with skilled illustrators in Rome, where he spent much of his exile, the Archbishop created detailed visual records that attempted to capture not only the physical appearance of these creatures, but also the atmospheric conditions that surrounded their appearances. These illustrations, preserved alongside the textual accounts, provided additional layers of evidence that supported the consistency of the testimonies he had collected. The artistic process itself became a form of investigation. When multiple witnesses provided descriptions of the same type of creature, Magnus would have his illustrators create separate drawings based on each account, then compare the results to identify common elements and discrepancies. The degree of consistency that emerged from this process was remarkable, particularly considering that many of the witnesses had no contact with each other and came from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. The implications of Magnus' work extended far beyond natural history. If his documentation was accurate, it suggested that human understanding of the natural world was far more limited than Renaissance scholars had assumed. The creatures described in his accounts possessed abilities: communication across vast distances, manipulation of physical forces, apparent telepathic or empathic connections with other species that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between different forms of consciousness. The theological implications were equally profound. The sirens' apparent understanding of Christian concepts, combined with their clearly non-human nature, raised questions about the universality of spiritual experience that troubled Magnus considerably. Were these creatures possessed of souls? And if so, what was their relationship to divine creation? Did their existence imply that God's plan encompassed forms of consciousness that human theology had not anticipated? Magnus' approach to these questions was characteristically methodical. Rather than attempting to force his observations into existing theological frameworks, he documented them as accurately as possible while acknowledging the limitations of human understanding. His work represented a form of empirical theology that would not be fully appreciated until centuries later, when the relationship between scientific observation and religious faith became a central concern of modern thought. The practical implications of Magnus' documentation were immediate and significant. Sailors and merchants who had access to his accounts found that they could predict certain types of encounters based on seasonal patterns, oceanographic conditions, and the behavior of conventional marine life. The presence of unusually organized fish schools, for example, often preceded sea serpent sightings by several hours. Unusual phosphorescence in the water frequently indicated the presence of sirens in the vicinity. These practical applications gave Magnus' work a credibility that purely theoretical treatises might have lacked. Ship captains who initially approached his accounts with skepticism found that the behavioral patterns he described proved useful for navigation and safety. The knowledge that certain types of creatures appeared more frequently during specific weather conditions or in particular geographic regions allowed mariners to adjust their routes and practices accordingly. The network of correspondence that Magnus established throughout the Nordic regions continued to provide him with new accounts throughout the 1540s and 1550s. The consistency of these later reports with his earlier documentation strengthened his confidence in the reliability of his sources and the objective reality of the phenomena he was describing. The creatures appeared to be not mythological constructs, but actual biological entities whose behavior could be studied and predicted using systematic observation. As Magnus aged and his health declined, he became increasingly concerned about preserving his documentation for future generations. The political and religious upheavals of his era threatened to scatter his carefully assembled archives, and he recognized that the knowledge he had gathered might be lost if not properly preserved. Working with scribes and translators, he created multiple copies of his most important accounts, distributing them to libraries and monasteries throughout Europe in hopes that at least some would survive the turbulent times ahead. The archbishop's final years were spent not in gathering new accounts, but in analyzing the patterns that had emerged from decades of documentation. He began to perceive connections between the various types of creatures that suggested a complex hierarchy of marine consciousness, with the Leviathans serving as ancient guardians or repositories of oceanic memory, the sirens functioning as intermediaries and communicators, and the serpents acting as active participants in the day-to-day maintenance of marine ecosystems. This interpretation led Magnus to develop what might be called a theology of the oceans, a framework for understanding the spiritual significance of these encounters that went beyond simple cataloging of unusual species. In his view, the creatures represented aspects of divine creation that challenged human assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. Their existence suggested that the boundaries between different forms of life were far more fluid than terrestrial experience indicated. The legacy of Magnus' work extended well beyond his own lifetime. His methodical approach to documenting seemingly impossible phenomena established precedents that would influence natural philosophers and scientists for centuries to come. The idea that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, while not original to Magnus, found in his work a practical demonstration of how such evidence could be systematically gathered and evaluated. More importantly, Magnus' documentation preserved accounts of encounters that might otherwise have been dismissed as sailors' tales or religious visions. By treating these testimonies as legitimate sources of information about the natural world, he created a record of human-ocean interaction that provides modern researchers with unprecedented insights into both historical maritime culture and the possible existence of unknown marine species. The creatures described in Magnus' accounts have not been entirely forgotten by modern science. Deep-sea exploration has revealed the existence of marine organisms that display characteristics remarkably similar to those described by 16th-century witnesses. Giant squids, once dismissed as mythological, have been found to possess intelligence and behavioral complexity that matches many elements of the siren accounts. Bioluminescent organisms in the deep ocean create light displays that could easily account for the phosphorescence described in Leviathan encounters. Perhaps most significantly, modern understanding of ocean acoustics has revealed that large marine organisms can indeed communicate across vast distances using sound frequencies that would be perceived by human ears, exactly as Magnus witnesses described. The songs of whales travel for thousands of miles through ocean waters, and the discovery that some marine species use echolocation and sound-based hunting techniques validates many of the behavioral observations recorded in Magnus' collection. The question of whether Magnus' witnesses encountered unknown species or misinterpreted known phenomena may be less important than the broader implications of his work. His documentation represents one of the earliest systematic attempts to gather empirical evidence about phenomena that challenged existing paradigms of understanding. The methods he developed for collecting and evaluating testimony from multiple independent sources established principles that remain fundamental to scientific investigation today. The creatures of Magnus' accounts, whether interpreted as unknown species, misidentified known animals, or something else entirely, serve as reminders of the vast mysteries that still exist in Earth's oceans. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been mapped in detail, and new species are discovered regularly in deep-sea environments that were completely unknown in Magnus' time. The possibility that his witnesses encountered representatives of species that remain unknown to modern science cannot be dismissed entirely. More importantly, Magnus' work demonstrates the value of taking seriously the observations of people whose lives bring them into contact with environments that scholars and scientists rarely experience directly. The fishermen, sailors, and merchants who provided his accounts possessed practical knowledge of marine environments that no amount of theoretical study could replicate. Their observations, filtered through Magnus' scholarly rigor, created a unique synthesis of experiential knowledge and systematic investigation. The theological dimensions of Magnus' work also retain contemporary relevance. His struggle to understand the spiritual implications of encounters with apparently non-human consciousness anticipates modern debates about the nature of intelligence, the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, and the ethical obligations that humans might have toward other forms of conscious life. The questions he raised about the universality of spiritual experience and the boundaries of divine creation continue to challenge both religious and secular worldviews. In the end, the testimony of Olaus Magnus stands as a monument to human curiosity and the courage required to document phenomena that challenge comfortable assumptions about reality. Whether his accounts describe literal encounters with unknown species or represent something else entirely, they preserve a record of human engagement with mystery that reminds us how much we still do not understand about the world we inhabit. His work suggests that the boundary between the known and unknown is far more permeable than we often assume, and that careful attention to the experiences of those who venture into unfamiliar territories may reveal truths that purely theoretical approaches cannot reach. The legacy of the great cartographer extends beyond his specific documentation of marine encounters to encompass a broader understanding of how knowledge is created and preserved. His systematic approach to gathering testimony, his willingness to document phenomena that challenged existing paradigms, and his recognition that human understanding is always provisional and incomplete establish principles that remain relevant to any serious investigation of the unknown. In an age when the boundaries of human knowledge continue to expand into previously unimaginable territories, the example of Olaus Magnus reminds us that the most important discoveries often come from paying careful attention to the accounts of those who have ventured beyond the comfortable boundaries of the familiar world. The seasonal patterns that emerge from Magnus' extensive documentation reveal the complexity to these marine encounters that suggested deliberate behaviors rather than random appearances. The great serpents showed a marked tendency to surface during the spring months, particularly in regions where Arctic ice was beginning to break up. This timing coincided with the migration patterns of various whale species, leading Magnus to theorize that the serpents might be following these massive mammals for reasons that extended beyond simple predation. Father Johannes Eriksson of the monastery at Turku provided Magnus with detailed observations that supported this theory. During the spring of 1541, Father Johannes had been aboard a fishing vessel in the Gulf of Bothnia when the crew encountered both whales and serpents in close proximity. Rather than attacking the whales, the serpents appear to be engaged in some form of collaborative behavior. The massive reptiles positioned themselves alongside the whales, matching their swimming speed and direction with remarkable precision. The interaction between these species defied conventional understanding of marine predator-prey relationships. Father Johannes observed that smaller fish seemed to be herded between the whales and serpents, creating dense concentrations of prey that both species could exploit efficiently. The whales would dive deeply, driving schools of fish toward the surface, where the serpents waited to intercept them. This coordination suggested a level of interspecies communication that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and behavior. Even more remarkable was Father Johannes's observation that this cooperative hunting appeared to be guided by complex vocalizations exchanged between the whales and serpents. The whales produced their characteristic songs, but these were answered by the serpents with calls that seemed specifically designed to harmonize with the whale vocalizations. The result was an intricate acoustic pattern that Father Johannes described as resembling a vast underwater choir, with each species contributing distinct but complementary elements to the overall composition. Magnus recognized that these observations had profound implications for understanding the nature of consciousness in marine environments. If serpents and whales could indeed coordinate their behavior through complex acoustic communication, it suggested that the oceans hosted forms of intelligence that operated according to principles entirely foreign to terrestrial experience. The collaborative hunting patterns described by Father Johannes implied planning, mutual understanding, and perhaps even cultural transmission of knowledge between generations of marine organisms. The documentation process itself began to reveal unexpected patterns as Magnus' archive grew more comprehensive. Witnesses from widely separated geographic regions reported remarkably similar behavioral characteristics in the creatures they encountered, but with subtle variations that suggested either regional subspecies or learned cultural differences within the same species. The serpents encountered in Norwegian waters, for example, displayed hunting behaviors that were distinctly different from those observed in the Baltic Sea, despite the creature's otherwise identical physical characteristics. Captain Nils Anderson of the merchant vessel Storm Rider encountered a group of Baltic serpents during the summer of 1542 that demonstrated hunting techniques unlike any previously documented. Rather than the collaborative whale-herding behavior observed in more northern waters, these serpents employed what could only be described as agricultural methods. The creatures had apparently modified a series of underwater rock formations to create natural fish traps, using their powerful bodies to move massive stones into configurations that would funnel migrating fish into confined areas. The sophistication of these modifications astonished Captain Anderson and his crew. The rock arrangements showed clear evidence of planning and engineering skill, with channels carved into the seafloor to direct water flow in ways that would maximize the effectiveness of the traps. Most remarkably, the serpents appear to maintain these installations over extended periods, returning regularly to repair damage caused by storms and to modify the configurations based on changing migration patterns of their prey. This agricultural approach to marine hunting represented a level of environmental manipulation that Magnus found deeply troubling from a theological perspective. The ability to modify natural landscapes for productive purposes had traditionally been viewed as a uniquely human capability, one that reflected humanity's special relationship with divine creation. If serpents could indeed engage in what amounted to underwater farming, the implications for understanding the nature of consciousness and divine intention were staggering. The sirens presented their own unique patterns of seasonal behavior that further complicated Magnus' attempts to understand these creatures within existing frameworks of natural philosophy. Unlike the serpents, which appeared to follow relatively predictable migration routes, the sirens seemed to appear and disappear according to criteria that had no obvious relationship to oceanographic conditions or the behavior of other marine species. Brother Marcus of the Franciscan monastery at Bergen provided Magnus with one of the most perplexing accounts in his collection. During the autumn of 1543, Brother Marcus had been traveling by boat to deliver sacred texts to remote coastal communities when his vessel was approached by a group of sirens who appeared to be specifically seeking him out. The creatures had somehow learned of his presence aboard the boat and had apparently traveled a considerable distance to intercept his journey. The sirens' behavior during this encounter suggested that they possessed detailed knowledge not only of Brother Marcus's location, but of his personal history and scholarly interests. They showed particular fascination with the illuminated manuscripts he was carrying, somehow perceiving the contents of sealed containers without opening them. When Brother Marcus attempted to show them one of the texts, the sirens responded with musical phrases that seemed to comment on specific passages, despite their apparent inability to read human writing. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the sirens' apparent knowledge of events from Brother Marcus's past that he had never shared with anyone. They sang melodies that seemed to reference his childhood in the mountains of Norway, his early religious education, and even private spiritual experiences that he had recorded only in his personal journal. This intimate knowledge suggested either extraordinary telepathic abilities or access to sources of information that transcended normal sensory perception. Magnus struggled to reconcile accounts like Brother Marcus's with his understanding of natural law and divine order. If the sirens could indeed access human memories and private experiences, what were the implications for concepts of individual privacy and spiritual autonomy? The possibility that these creatures could penetrate the innermost thoughts and experiences of human beings raise questions about the nature of consciousness itself that had no precedent in medieval or Renaissance philosophy. The Leviathans continued to represent the most mysterious category in Magnus' collection, with each new account adding layers of complexity to an already incomprehensible phenomenon. Captain Gunnar Olafsson of the whaling vessel Northern Star provided Magnus with an account that suggested these massive creatures possessed abilities that bordered on the supernatural. In the winter of 1544, Captain Olafsson's ship had been trapped in pack ice north of Iceland when his crew observed what they initially took to be an aurora borealis of unusual intensity. The lights appeared to be emanating not from the sky, but from beneath the ice, creating patterns of illumination that seemed to respond to the movements of the trapped vessel. As the crew watched in amazement, the ice around their ship began to crack and shift, not randomly, but in geometric patterns that created a clear channel leading toward open water. The source of both the lights and the ice manipulation became apparent when a Leviathan surfaced near the ship. The creature's body was covered with bioluminescent organs that pulsed in complex patterns, creating the underwater light show that had first attracted the crew's attention. More remarkably, the creature appeared to be deliberately using some form of energy emission to weaken and reshape the ice formations around the ship. Captain Olafsson observed that the Leviathan's ice manipulation abilities were not crude applications of brute force, but sophisticated techniques that took advantage of natural stress patterns in the ice. The creature seemed to understand the structural properties of frozen seawater with the expertise of an experienced engineer, applying precisely calibrated energy pulses to create controlled fractures that achieved maximum effect with minimal effort. The rescue process took nearly 12 hours to complete, during which time the Leviathan maintained continuous communication with the trapped crew through a series of low-frequency vocalizations that seemed designed to provide reassurance. Captain Olafsson noted that these sounds had a profoundly calming effect on his men, reducing the panic and despair that might otherwise have overwhelmed them during such a dangerous situation. The implications of this encounter extended far beyond simple animal behavior into territories that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence and intention. The Leviathan had apparently recognized the crew's distress, understood their predicament, and chosen to provide assistance using abilities that no known natural process could explain. The creature's actions suggested not only intelligence, but compassion, a willingness to help members of another species despite receiving no obvious benefit in return. Magnus found himself forced to confront the possibility that these massive beings possessed moral sensibilities that were not only equal to, but perhaps superior to those of human beings. The selfless nature of the rescue described by Captain Olafsson implied a form of ethical consciousness that transcended species boundaries, suggesting that divine providence might operate through agencies that human theology had never anticipated. The accumulating evidence from Magnus' network of correspondence began to paint a picture of marine ecosystems that operated according to principles that had no equivalent in terrestrial environments. The creatures he documented appeared to exist within complex social and ecological networks that spanned vast distances and involved forms of communication and coordination that challenged every assumption about the limits of animal consciousness. Father Erik Gustafsson of the cathedral at Trondheim provided Magnus with observations that suggested these marine intelligences were actively studying human behavior just as intensively as humans were attempting to understand them. During the summer of 1545, Father Erik had been conducting baptismal ceremonies at a coastal church when the congregation was startled by the appearance of several sirens in the nearby harbor. Rather than fleeing when they noticed the human gathering, the creatures positioned themselves where they could observe the religious proceedings with apparent fascination. The sirens remained in the harbor throughout the entire ceremony, their behavior suggesting careful study of the human rituals they were witnessing. They seemed particularly interested in the musical elements of the service, responding to hymns and chants with vocalizations that appeared to be attempts at harmonic accompaniment rather than mere mimicry. When the congregation sang the Gloria, the sirens joined in with voices that, while clearly non-human, created harmonies that enhanced rather than disrupted the musical worship. Father Erik's account described a moment of profound spiritual confusion when he realized that the sirens' participation in the ceremony seemed to express genuine religious sentiment. Their vocalizations during prayers conveyed an unmistakable sense of reverence and worship, suggesting that these creatures possessed spiritual sensibilities that transcended the boundaries of human religious experience. The possibility that non-human beings might have independent relationships with divine reality forced Father Erik to question fundamental assumptions about the exclusivity of human spiritual consciousness. The theological implications of such encounters were so profound that Magnus found himself corresponding with some of the most learned ecclesiastical authorities of his time, seeking guidance on how to interpret these phenomena within the framework of Christian doctrine. The responses he received revealed deep divisions among church scholars about the spiritual status of creatures that appeared to possess consciousness and moral sensibilities, but existed outside the traditional categories of divine creation. Some authorities argued that the creatures described in Magnus' accounts must be demonic manifestations designed to test human faith and lead believers astray from orthodox religious understanding. This interpretation provided a convenient framework for dismissing the evidence without confronting its implications, but Magnus found it inadequate to explain the consistently benevolent and even protective behavior displayed by these beings. Other scholars suggested that Magnus' documentation might reveal previously unknown aspects of divine creation that had been hidden from human understanding until providential timing made their revelation appropriate. This interpretation allowed for the possibility that the creatures were legitimate parts of God's creation, while acknowledging that their existence challenged conventional theological categories. Magnus himself developed what might be called a theology of cosmic diversity, proposing that divine creation might be far more extensive and varied than human understanding had previously encompassed. In his view, the existence of intelligent marine species suggested that consciousness and spiritual awareness might be more widely distributed throughout creation than human-centered theology had assumed. Rather than diminishing human dignity, the existence of other forms of conscious life might actually enhance appreciation for the infinite creativity and complexity of divine providence. The practical implications of Magnus' developing theological framework became apparent as his correspondents began reporting changes in human-marine interactions that seemed to reflect growing mutual understanding between species. Captain Lars Johansen of the trading vessel Sea Eagle described an encounter during the spring of 1546 that demonstrated unprecedented cooperation between human sailors and marine creatures. Captain Johansen's ship had been pursuing what appeared to be a promising whale hunt when his crew realized they were competing with a group of serpents for the same prey. Rather than the territorial conflict that might have been expected, the situation developed into an extraordinary example of interspecies cooperation. The serpents appeared to recognize that the human hunters posed no threat to them personally and began to coordinate their hunting efforts with those of the ship's crew. The collaboration involved complex tactical planning that required real-time communication between species with entirely different sensory capabilities and hunting methodologies. The serpents used their superior underwater mobility to drive whales toward positions where the human hunters could deploy their harpoons most effectively, while the humans provided surface-level coordination that allowed the serpents to anticipate the movements of their prey more accurately. The success of this collaborative hunt produced benefits that exceeded what either species could have achieved independently. The humans secured whale products sufficient to supply their needs for months, while the serpents gained access to portions of the whale carcasses that were specifically valuable to their species, but of little interest to human hunters. The arrangement demonstrated a level of interspecies economic cooperation that had no precedent in human experience. Captain Johansen's account described the profound emotional impact of working alongside creatures whose intelligence and cooperative capabilities matched or exceeded those of his human crew members. The experience forced him to reconceptualize his understanding of humanity's place in the natural world, suggesting that humans might be participants in rather than masters of a complex community of conscious beings. The documentation provided by Magnus' correspondents began to reveal that these cooperative relationships were not isolated incidents, but part of emerging patterns of interspecies interaction that were developing throughout the Nordic seas. Fishing communities along the Norwegian coast reported that sirens had begun providing warnings about dangerous weather conditions, using musical signals that experienced mariners learned to interpret as reliable meteorological forecasts. These weather predictions proved remarkably accurate, often providing advance notice of storms and dangerous sea conditions with precision that exceeded any human forecasting capabilities available at the time. The sirens' apparent ability to sense atmospheric and oceanographic changes hours or even days before human instruments could detect them suggested access to environmental information through sensory modalities that remained completely mysterious to human science. The symbiotic relationship that developed between coastal communities and marine intelligences created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange between species. Fishermen reported learning new techniques for net construction and deployment from observing siren fishing methods, while the sirens appeared to be studying human tool use and technological innovation with obvious interest. Brother Olaf of the monastery at Stavanger described an extraordinary encounter during the autumn of 1547 that demonstrated the depth of intellectual curiosity that these creatures possessed regarding human culture and technology. A group of sirens had approached the coastal monastery during a period when the monks were engaged in copying manuscripts, and the creatures showed intense fascination with the process of written communication. The sirens appear to understand that the marks being made on parchment represented a form of permanent information storage, and they began experimenting with their own methods of creating lasting records. Using materials gathered from the seafloor, they constructed elaborate arrangements of shells, stones, and marine vegetation that seemed to function as three-dimensional text conveying complex information through spatial relationships and material properties. Brother Olaf observed that these marine manuscripts possessed organizational principles that were clearly systematic, suggesting that the Sirens had developed sophisticated methods for encoding and preserving information that operated according to principles entirely different from human writing systems. The creatures seemed to be attempting to create hybrid communication systems that would allow information exchange between species with fundamentally different sensory capabilities and cognitive structures. The implications of such developments suggested that Magnus was documenting not merely the existence of unknown species, but the emergence of interspecies civilization that might represent an entirely new phase in the evolution of consciousness on Earth. The collaborative relationships developing between humans and marine intelligences created possibilities for cultural and technological exchange that had no precedent in human history. Magnus recognized that his role as documenter of these phenomena had evolved into something far more significant than he had originally anticipated. Rather than simply cataloging unusual natural history, he was preserving the record of humanity's first contact with forms of consciousness that were genuinely alien, yet unmistakably benevolent. The knowledge he was gathering would be essential for future generations who would inherit a world where the boundaries between human and non-human intelligence had been permanently transformed. The responsibility of preserving such momentous information weighed heavily on the aging archbishop. As his health declined and political pressures continued to threaten his scholarly work, Magnus became increasingly concerned about ensuring that the knowledge he had gathered would survive the turbulent times ahead. The accounts he had collected represented not just natural history, but the foundation for an entirely new understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and the divine plan that encompassed forms of life beyond human imagination. Working with trusted associates, Magnus began creating a comprehensive archive that would preserve not only the specific accounts he had gathered, but the methodological principles he had developed for evaluating and interpreting extraordinary claims. His goal was to establish precedents that would guide future investigators who might encounter similar phenomena, ensuring that the knowledge gained through his decades of careful documentation would not be lost to skepticism or theological controversy. The legacy of Olaus Magnus extends far beyond his specific contributions to natural history into the realm of consciousness studies and interspecies communication. His documentation of marine intelligences established principles for recognizing and studying forms of consciousness that operate according to principles different from human cognition, while his theological reflections provided frameworks for understanding the spiritual implications of contact with non-human intelligences. Perhaps most significantly, Magnus' work demonstrated that careful attention to the experiences of those who venture into unfamiliar territories can reveal truths about the nature of reality that purely theoretical approaches cannot reach. His systematic approach to gathering and evaluating testimony from multiple independent sources established methodological standards that remain relevant to any serious investigation of phenomena that challenge existing paradigms of understanding. The creatures documented in Magnus' accounts continue to inspire scientific investigation and philosophical reflection centuries after their initial documentation. Whether interpreted as encounters with unknown species, misidentified known animals, or something else entirely, these accounts remind us that the boundaries of human knowledge remain provisional and that the most important discoveries often emerge from the careful study of experiences that challenge our comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality.